Learning styles and learning differences. As we approach teaching reading and writing and spelling, it's important that we consider the learning styles of our students. I have discovered that students can fall into one of two categories. They're often either logical literal or intuitive. Now, these are my own categories, but a logical literal student likes rules. They like to figure out how things work. Many of these students are natural at math and at science, and they love engineering skills and building things. And these students need to be taught the answers to why. They need to understand something in order to really learn it. Then we also have intuitive students. These students tend to really grasp the big picture. Many of them are strong language students. And these students seem to be able to deal with a lot more ambiguity in subjects and to be able to move forward regardless. Now, there's strengths to being a logical literal student and strengths to being an intuitive student. And we need to teach in a way that strengthens both of them. In addition, what I found is when we teach the rules and phonograms, when we teach language systematically, both logical, literal, and intuitive students excel with language. This is because intuitive students benefit from understanding the whys. They benefit from the reasons, and they're able to often take that and use it and go even farther with it. And logical, literal students need this information in order to become strong readers and spellers. I've also noticed that there's another way we can think about students. There are creative students, and then there are concrete students. The creative students want to write stories and draw pictures, and they just approach the world very, very creatively, and maybe more creative in an artistic sense. And then there are concrete students. These students can also be creative, but they tend to not want to draw fanciful pictures or to tell stories about things. They want to understand the world, and they want to work more in the here and now, factual information. Well, we need to respect the learning styles of both of these types of students as well. And it's often the creative students, those who are more daydreamers, who often get kind of looked aside in our classrooms today. But we can use the gifts of creative students in learning to read and spell. This is a picture of a drawing that was done by one very creative student who was learning the rule. We often double F, L, and S after a single vowel at the end of a base word. And what she did here is she put the rule to story, and she drew a picture of it. You'll notice the S's are best friends, and they're holding hands. And oh, by the way, they're wearing lipstick too, because they both like lipstick. And the teacher is a backwards F, but she's backwards, and I don't remember all the reasons. There was a whole story about it. And what you'll discover is that when creative students are allowed to exercise their gift and practice rules and practice phonograms in a way that tells a story or draws a picture, all of us benefit, because if those students get up in front of the class and share their illustration of it, we'll all remember it better. There are also the traditional learning styles: visual, auditory, and kinesthetic. The visual component of reading is seeing the shapes on the page. And in order to be able to read well, we need to be able to recognize those shapes. And students who are very visual are good at this, but students who are maybe more auditory and who learn through hearing might struggle more with the visual component. But there's also an auditory component to reading, and that is speaking and listening. All of the words on a page and all of the sentences are all trying to communicate something that could be spoken. And in fact, it's very fascinating because when someone is a good reader, they're not using primarily the visual centers of their brain. They're using primarily the auditory processing centers, the same places of their brain that they use when they're speaking and listening to someone. There's also students who are very kinesthetic. These students learn through movement, through doing something. And reading has a natural kinesthetic component. The kinesthetic component of reading is writing. And when we write, we experience the shapes kinesthetically. In fact, in the handwriting segment, we're going to talk about some of the research that links the importance of handwriting to understanding the phonograms and the letters in a kinesthetic manner. Before we do that, though, I want to talk about learning styles at another level. I think it's really, really important as teachers that we begin to understand and to appreciate the gifts of our students. One of the problems I really see in American society today is we tend to focus on the weakness of students. We tend to focus on their disability or what's wrong with them and are continually trying to fix that. And as an educator and as a parent, I have been very challenged in the last few years to begin to think about a student's strengths and then to begin to understand that those strengths sometimes have a negative side or a weakness to them, and that we can then leverage those strengths to help them develop their gifts to their fullest potential. And we need to make sure that we don't allow their weaknesses to get in the way and hinder them, but rather, by focusing on strengths, we can really help the student not only build confidence, but to develop their gifts and become who they are. So one of the things I recommend that all teachers do, and all parents, is watch a movie. This movie is called Thinking in Pictures, and it is about the life of Temple Grandin. Dr. Grandin was named one of the top 100 most influential people in the world by Time magazine last year in 2011. Dr. Grandin designed cattle processing facilities that are used throughout the United States to humanely process cattle. And she is world-renowned for her animal research work. And what's also fascinating about Temple Grandin is that she has autism. And in the movie Thinking in Pictures, what you are going to discover is what it's like to be a strong visual learner. And she is incredibly gifted. In fact, it is her gift of thinking visually that allows her to do her work with animals and allows her to design complex facilities. She says that she can walk through a facility that she is designing in 3D in her mind, right down to the bolts and screws that are in those drawings. It's an incredible, incredible gift. But in the movie Thinking in Pictures, what you will discover is the journey that she went through and her teachers went through as they discovered her gift, as they discovered how she thinks. And I think it's really helpful because it can help us, if we're not a strong visual learner, to understand how someone who's not like us thinks, and to really begin to appreciate the beauty and the power of that gift. And then it might give us some ideas too as teachers and how to harness that gift and to use it to help the student to learn other subjects and to learn things that are maybe more difficult so that they can go on and fulfill their dreams. Another story that has really impacted me is the story of Jillian Lynne, told by Sir Ken Robinson on TED.com in his presentation, How Schools Kill Creativity. In this presentation, Sir Ken Robinson tells a story about Jillian Lynne. When Jillian was young, her mother brought her to the physician and said that she couldn't sit still in school, she wasn't focusing, her grades were not good. And she began to ask the physician what she could do about this. And the physician said, we need to step out of the room and speak privately. As he took her out of the room, he turned on the radio and he said, let's stop and watch Jillian for a few moments. And as they watched, Jillian began to dance. And he said, what? There's nothing wrong with Jillian. She's a dancer. Bring her to a dance school. When Jillian got to the dance school, she met people like herself, people who thought through movement. Now, that line really changed my life because I learn auditorily and through speaking. And so the idea of learning through movement was a new concept for me. Well, Jillian Lynne went on and she became the head of the Royal Ballet in London. She formed the Jillian Lynne Dance Studios. She has since choreographed Cats and Phantom of the Opera. She is a multi-millionaire and she has given pleasure to millions. Someone else would have told her, sit still, calm down, and her gift may have been lost to the world. As teachers and parents, it's really important that we understand the kinesthetic gift and that we embrace it rather than fight it. Kinesthetic students can, first of all, teach us to be more healthy. As a society, we are often talking about the problems of childhood obesity, and then we tell kids to sit still and to calm down and to constantly, we're telling them to be still. But when we embrace kinesthetic students, we'll get moving and we'll be more healthy. Also, in my own life, I learned a lesson with my youngest daughter. She is very kinesthetic and had a very difficult time sitting still and focusing as well. And when I watched this video, it changed how I parented her. And she began to compete on an elite gymnastics team, one that I would have said no to before, where she was training 4 or 5 or even 6 hours a day in addition to her schoolwork. And what Hannah said to me at one point was, she said, you know what, when I don't get adequate exercise, or when I don't get enough exercise, it's really hard to focus. And her idea of enough exercise was 4 or more hours a day. Now, enough exercise for me might be a half an hour or an hour, but if you're kinesthetic, you need to move. So one of the takeaway points from this is that when we have students in school settings who aren't focusing, sometimes our instinct is to have more tutoring and more sedentary activities where they're supposed to study, but maybe the best thing to do is actually to get them involved in an intense sports program so that the time they are studying is more fruitful and more productive. This is also a good message for all of us to be able to understand that movement often makes us more productive. You know, a short workout can bring us back to our work and give us new perspective on that work and new and fresh ideas. So we need to embrace kinesthetic students. We need to embrace auditory students and visual students and their gifts, and understand how they all contribute to a better and more beautiful society. It's also important that we embrace their gifts in the classroom, because when we understand that there are different learning styles, we will teach using multi-sensory instruction. And multi-sensory instruction is one that uses all the learning styles, and that then means that we're using different areas of the brain as well. So when you learn something by movement, you're going to use the gross motor regions of your brain. And when you learn something through hearing, you'll use the auditory centers. And when you learn something visually, you'll use the visual centers. And when you do this all simultaneously, you'll build synapses across those regions, and the learning is faster and deeper for all students. So when we teach, we need to use all 4 learning modes. The 4 learning modes are seeing, hearing, doing, and speaking. Now, a presentation on the learning styles in reading wouldn't be complete without discussing dyslexia. I don't want to spend a lot of time here. However, on page 52, there are some resources listed for you, books that you can read and further information. But what I do want you to understand is that dyslexia simply means difficulty with words, and that there are 2 types of dyslexia. There's visual dyslexia. These are students who struggle with reading because they struggle with reversals and they struggle with the visual side of reading. There's also auditory dyslexia. So students who struggle with auditory processing, following auditory directions, or listening to stories often will also struggle with reading, because reading is at its heart an auditory activity where you have to be able to comprehend that language. So when you are evaluating a student for possible dyslexia, it's helpful to try to understand which piece are they really struggling with. Is it visual? Is it auditory? As part of finding them appropriate solutions. It's also might be helpful to know that there are some really neat books that have come out recently, such as The Gift of Dyslexia or The Dyslexic Advantage, which are beginning to describe dyslexia more as a learning style and a learning gift, and seeing some of the strengths that dyslexic tendencies bring, rather than just seeing it as a negative and as a disability. And I think you'd be very encouraged by those books as well. When we talk about reading development, it's very important to discuss physical development as well, and its component in reading. Now, in order to read well, we have to have eyes that function together in the direction of reading and writing. And this skill has nothing to do with intellect. It has to do with the muscles of the eyes. And when the eyes are not working well together, it can result in things like confused directionality and reversals. Now, visual muscle memory is something that we can train in students, and we need to think of training the eyes when we're training the muscles more like you would think of training your fingers if you're learning to play piano. It takes practice. It takes repetition. It's not something that just happens automatically. For some students, learning for their eyes to learn to work together in the direction of reading and writing seems to happen magically and almost instantaneously. And for others, it takes a lot of practice to get their eyes to work together in the direction of reading and writing. So here's just a few simple tips. First of all, stand or sit in front of your students when you're instructing them about language. In this way, you can put texts or your samples to the left side of you, and then your students will look at you and then to the text, and at you and then to the text. And in this way, they're practicing that directionality. And that's just a very simple tip. Also, it's important to understand that you don't want them sitting at a right angle to you, because I have spoken to many adults who are dyslexic who say that even translating at a right angle can be very difficult for them. So in the classroom setting, you need to be aware of your students who might have visual or directionality issues. Also, do everything in the direction of reading and writing. So if you're writing on the board, cross your T's, underline things in the direction of reading and writing, even erase the board in the direction of reading and writing, because the students will watch that and follow it, and it provides some practice with their visual muscle memory. When you're reading aloud to students, it can also be really helpful to show the text and to just follow along with your finger for a while, because students will then follow naturally. Now, they may not follow the whole time that you're reading, but they'll get some more practice with this. When you arrange students in a classroom or when they're doing homework at home, it's also important to not have them sitting across from each other. Now, I know that group work is really, really vital to collaboration and to developing those sorts of skills of working together. But in our early classrooms, we need to understand that this can create visual and directionality issues for young students. And so when they're writing text or reading, it's really helpful to have them where they can't see the person across from them. Now, one way you could handle this is to put a little barrier across the table so they can't see the other person's work, because when they see that, they're seeing words upside down, and if there's someone sitting to the right of them, they're seeing them sideways. And this often shows up in young students writing with letters upside down or backwards. And if we can keep the visual input all in one direction, it will minimize confusion for those students until that has really solidified. This is also something really simple that you can do with the students who are struggling. If you notice a student has a lot of reversals or upside down letters, make sure that you try to minimize their exposure to seeing that in other students' work upside down. Also, for those of you teaching in a classical model, do not assign copy work to students until they can read at a second grade level. Because if they are copying a passage or a sentence and they can't read it, what they're doing is really artwork. They're just copying those shapes. And some students who have good visual skills and are strong visual learners will be able to do that easily. But students who are not strong visual learners will end up developing patterns where they reverse B's and D's and put things upside down. So copy work should be a language learning activity where they are able to read the passage, then write it, then go back and check it against what they had read in the first place. How many of you have seen or heard students read a sentence that says the cat is on the mat, something like this, the catty sun them at? Now, notice what the student here is doing is they're taking the end of the word and the beginning of the next word and blending them together. These students are confused about where words begin and end and what the spacing in words means. So the solution to this is good handwriting instruction. In fact, the solution to a lot of the issues that students struggle with visually with reading is to teach handwriting instruction in a systematic way.